Welcome back, Renegade Inc. Mitch Feierstein, great to have you in the studio.
Thanks for having me here.
Before we talk all things inflation, we've had a couple of eagle-eyed viewers who've written in and follow us on social media, and they mentioned that whenever you're on, there's a few things that you tend to, let's say they're hobby horses.
Oh no.
One of them is, when you mention Albert Einstein, you quote him saying the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Mm-hmm. The second is that you have a penchant for Elon Musk. You like
Absolutely.
You like mentioning him. And then finally, you will always mention that you can't ever taper a Ponzi scheme.
That's right.
So I've got a little bell, a Mitchy bell. If we go anywhere near them, it's like Pavlov. If we go anywhere near those areas, I'll call you out.
Oh no.
In that first half, Frank talked broadly and quite technically about inflation. Why is it when we talk about inflation, we never include housing, which is arguably one of the biggest bubbles around at the moment? Why do we never put housing in the basket?
Housing is really an important part, and it's termed as shelter. But what we've got to look at first before we get to that is probably the root causes of the greatest wealth inequality in history.
And what are they?
That's inflated by the asset bubbles that the Federal Reserve in the United States, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, and the European Central Bank have inflated. I mean, basically, they have not been telling the truth to anybody. And the problem now is you have narrative control, and we've actually entered a phase that I would call a twilight zone that's kind of Orwellian.
So what are they lying about, or what are they using a mission not to talk about?
Well, so if you look at going back into history, when Mark Carney ran the Bank of Canada, before he was recruited by George Osborne to come here and screw up our housing market in the UK and turn it into bubbles on steroids. So, with Help to Buy, which was a Ponzi scheme.
Help to Buoy.
Yeah, Help to Buoy is probably better, but so let's pay the top of the market. So you had Mark Carney come from the Bank of Canada to run the Bank of England. And what he did here was created a housing bubble unequal to any other. He did that in Canada and he imported it here. But then he also said, as you recall, that he wanted to reach escape velocity, to raise rates.
Famously.
Which was a total lie. I said, there will never be escape velocity. What you're going to have, and then Janet Yellen followed him and said, we're going to have liftoff in America. So these technocrats like to come up with these little catchy words like Build Back Better or escape velocity. And I said, you're not going to have either of those. What you're going to have is a crash on the launch pad.
When you were watching, Frank, during that first half, you said, I've got a chart for this. Let's just have a look at that chart, because it chimes into this velocity theme, doesn't it?
Well, the velocity of money is really important, because Ben Bernanke, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, back during the crisis, when he said subprime is contained, if you remember, this is another lie, along with liftoff and along with escape velocity. Just another lie was subprime is contained. As we know, subprime was not contained, and it was led to the credit crisis of 2008. If you look at the chart, what he claimed, he was a scholar of the Great Depression, and that was his claim to fame, Ben Bernanke. So he said that if you pump more money into the system, what you'll do is you'll create aggregate demand. And you remember Larry Summers, the bad penny that keeps appearing everywhere all the time, no matter how wrong he gets it. So these guys said, pump more money in, you'll create a wealth effect that trickles down. But this chart disproves that, because if you look, every time they had a monetary intervention, you saw that the velocity of money, M2, known as M2, goes down. So the money in circulation declines, because the banks hoard it. And if you look to the right side of the quadrant in the corner, you can see this is QE insanity. And you look that M2 just drops off a cliff. And when you go back and you talk about the central bankers, if you look at Christine Lagarde, who runs the European Central Bank, she was also running the IMF first, and she was indicted in France. I don't know if you remember, for that Sarkozy donor, some kind of bailout for him involving hundreds of millions of euros. Yes. She was actually indicted in France. So you've got an indicted criminal actually running the European Central Bank, which should give you a flavor as to why I'm saying the central banks are at one of the root causes of the problem of wealth inequality and how we got to where we are today.
Do you think wealth inequality then is the issue of the day? Because if you look, for instance, at the UK, sixth largest economy in the world, apparently. Poverty in the UK, the latest United Nations and Human Rights Watch reports that a fifth of the population, 14 million people, live in poverty in the UK. 1.5 million of the population experienced destitution in 2017. Close to 40% of children are predicted to be living in poverty by 2021. Food banks, as we know, proliferated, and homelessness and rough sleeping. You only have to walk around London to realise that that's gone through the roof. Is wealth inequality, the actions of central banks, the mechanism of the housing market, is that if you're going to address this, is that where to focus your attention?
I think you definitely need to focus there first. And I think what you need to look at with wealth inequality is you have people like the son-in-law of Infosys now that's come out and said child poverty and wealth inequality has improved since.
And for people who don't know that, it's a man called Rishi Sunak, right?
It came in. Oh, well, I'm sorry. Yeah, I guess so.
Eat out to spread it about.
So exactly. So the I like that. So the problem is that we have a record amount of child poverty in this country. And if you look at the way that the inflation is calculated, obviously it's in the Bureau of Economic Statistics here. It's in their interest to keep the inflation numbers low. So the basis for calculation for payouts like universal credit or whatever the welfare payment system mechanism is and the pension funds, they don't adequately adjust for the real costs of the economy. They use substitution, what's called substitution. So it's a disingenuous way of calculating the inflation numbers, so it appears that inflation is not as bad as it is.
What do you think the real world figure is for the UK?
High teens to 20%.
That much?
Well, how about this? Look at petrol costs. If you look at oil prices, they're up over 76% since last November. So look, to produce petrol, you need oil because it's the main component. So what's petrol up? 40%, 50%? How many people need to drive a car? But I forgot, because now that Sadiq Khan he's come out with a dictate saying no more petrol cars after October or diesel cars before a certain time period. So you can take the bus or take the tube, and that's it. Only the elites like myself can ride in style. So these factors all have to be looked at when you assess this, and the government needs to fund things because they've printed tons of money. So they have these smart highways that will now give you a ticket if you're 1 mile an hour over the speed limit. So nobody voted for this. What we have now is and it's really draconian what's going on. We have Carrie Antoinette running number 10 Downing Street, and Boris just sits there and nods, and you can't believe a word that comes out of his mouth. And this is a gigantic problem, because what we have, as well as a media that's supposed to be a check and a balance on our system of government, and they don't call it out. Instead, what they are political activists who support the narrative and push that narrative forward. And people seem to just become, look, a fearful public is an obedient and submissive public.
Yes.
Right? And this is what they're trying to achieve. And what they have now, they have suppression of free speech with censorship, like Twitter censors me and they shadow ban me. And so when that happens and you start censoring thought and free speech, you are sowing the seeds of a totalitarian dictatorship. And that's the direction we're headed in, and it's very dark. And I think what people need to do is speak out, put their heads above the parapet, and not vote for the same people that keep lying to you. Well, going back to your example now, they don't incorporate shelter costs, housing, whether it's rent or buy, adequately in the inflation figures. Then going back to central banks, people like Amazon borrow for 0%. People like Tesla borrow for 0%.
Oh yeah, almost. Is it Elon?
Right, Elon Musk. There you go, the muskrat. So Elon Musk, and so the problem is Amazon, as you saw, Jeff Bezos was laughing about going up in a spaceship for 10 minutes while he's barely paying his employees. He's the richest guy on the planet, and he pays zero tax. This is the problem.
That's the
moment.
moment.
No taxes.
That's the moment,
right.
Though, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you want, Bezos in a rocket going up to space doesn't pay a penny of tax. Wealth inequality absolutely massive. 55 million people in the US unbanked, can't enter into the economy. If you're going to crystallise a moment, is it that Bezos is doing space travel while no one else can live?
Well, this is the most savage point in history for economic plunder, and the diversions that are being used right now are what I would call woke wash. Right?
What's that?
So what they're doing is using the climate emergency, and they're using social justice, which they conflate with criminal justice, to hide the plunder by companies like Amazon, who doesn't pay a penny of tax, and his employees have to pee in a bottle because they don't have a break time, yet he's jumping onto his rocket to go up into outer space. So this is a laugh. And then you had Janet Yellen come out when she was in London about a month ago for the G7 or whatever it was, and she said, well, I hope everybody joins this global taxation, but I don't know if it'll apply to Amazon somewhere. She snuck off onto the side. And this is the richest guy in the world that doesn't pay any tax. So think about that as an example, that this is the problem with government. Government bends to the pay to play, the highest bidders, and this is why we don't have governance anymore.
How do you, though, start thinking about this? Because people don't want, they've worked hard all their life, their living standards are going down. How do they protect what they've got?
Well, I think there's a silver lining to this,
Good, because it's been quite dark, hasn't it?
It's pretty dark, but I think there's a silver lining, because I think with all the asset misprices that have been out there, I think that there are still very cheap assets, but people have to be very selective about where they put their money right now, and they've got to realize that the government is going to try to tax the heck out of you.
Right. So what are those assets that you've located or you've spotted? Because it's not houses in the UK, is it?
Well, no, it's not. I mean, I wouldn't put any money into houses. What I would do is I would take a look, and there is no one size fits all. So, I mean, you need to find somebody who's very skilled at it to evaluate what your exact situation is, and then prescribe, like a doctor would, what would basically hedge your existing exposures, and then you put on exposures, because there will be a big drawdown. I don't know when it'll happen, but there's got to be a big drawdown, because we've gone insane. What's happening is governments are spending over $10 to $14 to produce $1 in gross domestic product. So think about that. This is all debt that's done this. So we're not producing goods. So this isn't productive, and it hasn't been for 10 to 14 years. All they're doing is creating more debt. So you have Ponzi assets, real debt.
That's the definition of insanity, isn't it?
Right, exactly.
What was Albert Einstein saying about that?
He'd say this is going to end very badly, and it's going to hurt.
Excellent, Mitch. It's always good to have you. Thank you very much for your time. That's it from Renegade Inc. this week. You can email the team, studio@renegadeinc.com. Join us next week for more insight from those people who are thinking differently. But until then, stay curious.